So thanks for inviting me to speak. And this is a presentation of collaborative work with my Forest Service colleagues, Erica Svensson and Michelle Johnson. So I really start with a focus on stewardship and stewards themselves. And through that work, I've recently come to intersect lightly with this world of citizen science. But I'm not a citizen science expert, and I'm excited to learn from this incredible group today. I've already been quite inspired. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly introduce the New York City Urban Field Station for those that know it or don't know it. Then I'll discuss a bit about our StewMap research that investigates environmental stewardship as what we think a crucial piece of local environmental governance. Then I'll shift the focus from networks and organizations to individual stewards, and I'll talk about a study of Million Trees NYC tree planters. And then I'm just going to preview some really preliminary results from a study we did of Trees Count 2015 tree monitors. So we worked with Parks in a survey of these tree monitors. And then I'll just conclude with some reflections. So the New York City Urban Field Station is a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and the City of New York, the Department of Parks and Recreation. So the field station is both a sort of conceptual space and a physical place. We have an actual building at Fort Totten in Bayside, Queens, where we can have visiting researchers and practitioners come and stay with us for free for anywhere from 3 days to 3 months. So if you haven't come visit, please do. It's an incredible place. And a lot of what we're doing is building the sort of personnel and the data infrastructure for conducting long-term urban ecological research. And so we have field stations obviously here in Philly, in Baltimore, and in Chicago. And we're building on this tradition that the Forest Service has of experimental forests, but also the NSF Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And I just think this situating is important because I see it as an interesting model for that sort of co-production of knowledge between researchers and managers, where we're constantly sort of butting heads or rubbing elbows or sharing ideas with a goal of moving towards adaptive management. But we know that's not easy. So much of our own research, my research and Erica's, focuses on urban environmental stewardship, and here's how we define it. So we define stewards as groups that conserve, manage, monitor, educate about, or advocate for the local environment. And for us, that includes land, air, water, waste, toxics, sort of a very broad suite of the environment. And it includes everything from really overtly political acts, protest or advocacy, to more quotidian or everyday sort of leisure practices like gardening and everything in between. And we focused a lot on civil society, civic groups, and nonprofit organizations. Because in the urban sphere, a lot is known about the role of maybe the mayor or public agencies, as well as some of the private sector actors that shape space. We think less attention has been paid to the role of these really vital civic and community groups in managing urban environments. So also another sort of caveat we give is that these civic groups aren't solely environmental, right? They're groups that focus on youth, on senior citizens, on immigrants, on public health, where the environment is used as a means to improve community quality of life. And it's really nested in these other community concerns. And the groups range widely in their degree of professionalization. So they include, over $1 million professionalized groups with staff and budgets and boards, all the way to groups operating. About a third of the groups in New York City have 0 or 1 staff and budgets of under $1,000. And finally, they exist in large numbers and they persist over time, so they're not a flash in the pan, and nor is it just a post-1970s phenomenon. We've had prior waves of involvement in civic environmentalism from the progressive to the Victorian era, and we think it's interesting to track these groups over time because they influence how our urban space is designed, managed, and used. So with StewMap, our primary research question was, how do we understand the social and spatial interactions among actors working on urban stewardship? In other words, who's taking care of the urban environment? So we started this project in the mid-2000s, and green infrastructure mapping or green asset mapping was starting to become more common in urban environmental planning. So the map you see at left shows parks, green streets, and community gardens in New York City. Green streets being public right-of-way gardens. And there was a lot of work around, getting community gardens mapped and acknowledged as green space, and we thought that was really important, and we participated that in a public GIS sort of setting. But we also said, who's mapping the social infrastructure that's really caring for that space, and no one really was at the time. So at right, you see a map of about 2,800 civic groups citywide that are involved in stewardship. And another motivation for this was very practice-based. As practitioners, we saw that people were sometimes working in silos. So gardeners knew gardeners, parks people knew parks people, water people knew water people, but people weren't necessarily looking at the system in a holistic way, or might not even know that their neighbor just down the street was also participating in a different form of stewardship. So we created StewMap, and we worked with Dana Fisher, who's now at University of Maryland, to conduct a citywide survey of civic groups. And there was no existing list of these groups at the time. We had to build our population sort of from the bottom up. So 20 different citywide civic organizations shared their gold, they shared their group data with us, and then we surveyed these civic groups about who they are, what they do, where they physically work, and what their social networks are. So now, as you see at the bottom, the approach has been replicated in other cities where we have Forest Service scientists, and you can also speak with me or Sarah Lowe a bit more if you want to know more about the Philly StewMap. So we're also gearing up for our first longitudinal repeat of StewMap in New York City for 2017, and as daunting as that is with everything that's changed in the last decade, we're really excited to see how stewardship has changed over time, and Baltimore is gearing up to do repeats as well. So this is part of the goal, is comparative data sets across space and over time. So we asked a lot of things in the study, but one of them was we asked groups to tell us how they self-define their geographic turf. So for a community garden group, they might know their exact block and lot number that they manage, but for an air quality advocacy group, they might claim 3 neighborhoods. However they define it, that's their turf. We see that as groups' sort of territorial basis of power. And we think that asking groups to define their turf and then putting it on a public map is not a neutral act. It's one that seeks to render these civic groups and their civic action more visible. So this map at left shows an overlay of all the civic turfs citywide in New York City. And the darker the color means the more overlap in turf. It doesn't tell you anything about the amount of staff, the frequency of stewardship, anything about that. It's just an overlay, density overlay of turf. And you can see that there are quite a lot of groups in the South Bronx, in East Harlem, in Central Brooklyn, in areas that might be characterized as environmental justice neighborhoods. You have actually a lot of public stewardship happening in those places, and maybe a little less intensity in some of the more suburban form areas of Queens, where people have detached homes and private yards. And my colleague Michelle Johnson is working on spatial analysis across these cities to try and understand whether there are underlying patterns and consistencies to what explains the spatial pattern of stewardship. The quick answer is it's not that easy. And also, because we know these groups don't work alone, we looked at the connections among stewardship groups, and we used social network analysis to identify links between sectors and actors to understand stewardship as a system. So we asked every respondent to tell us their top partners in government, in business, in civil society, and in schools. And this, just blob is the total network map, but then you can tease it apart by sector or by site type. And that's what we found. Many of these groups are organizing in clusters by site type or by issue area. So sort of that premise that I started with before. A lot of the gardeners are hanging together. A lot of the water groups, they're just one link away. Others cluster geographically at the neighborhood level. And those on the periphery sometimes only connect to the main government nodes and not to these other stewardship umbrella organizations. We have a whole paper that's about the role of citywide civic brokers that I won't go into, but essentially there are about a dozen large nonprofit groups playing a crucial sort of function in this network. And for Philly, you can think about PHS being maybe the most prominent one, but in New York there are ones like NYRP, Grow NYC, the list goes on and on. So what we found is that there's this broad polycentric stewardship network in New York City that's not centralized or top-down, but it's really the governance structure of New York's urban nature. So basically, StewMap is this empirical research project to understand how stewardship looks and performs. It's also meant to be an applied tool. We make maps publicly available online. We query our data set. We share it with land managers. The goal there is to visualize these groups, which are sometimes unseen or maybe muted, and ultimately to try and build more parity or equity in the system. So I gave that really broad brush intro to StewMap to frame the way we think about urban stewardship, particularly at the organizational and network levels. And some of our more recent work has focused on individual stewards, looking both at tree planters and tree monitors. And so for both of those groups of people, we're asking these sorts of research questions. Who participates in stewardship activities? How do they mobilize? What's the relationship between stewardship and other forms of civic engagement? And what motivates people to participate in stewardship activities? And somebody mentioned earlier motivation being context specific, for sure, I think, in this instance of urban forestry, planting and monitoring, what are the motivations there? So this is work by Dana Fisher, James Connolly, and Erica Svensson looking at tree planters. So I'm really presenting it on their behalf. But what they wanted to understand was, with so many groups mobilizing to steward the city, how and why does that participation matter? And particularly, how does it matter for democracy? So there are a lot of scholars in the social sciences sort of talking about the decline of civic participation, maybe most famously Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone. But he actually had mused about a potential counter-trend, saying maybe there's something in this environmental movement that might prove interesting. And in essence, that's what Erica and Dana and James sought to understand. So they conducted in-person surveys of Million Trees NYC volunteers in New York City in 2010, and they did sort of randomized selection in the field and rapid interviews with adult volunteers. And they got a really high response rate, about 93%. So who are these tree planters? Overall, the volunteers were more white, more female, and more highly educated than the population of the city or the US, and that's pretty consistent with some of the other findings on this type of volunteerism in the US. And how did they hear about Million Trees? They found that personal, social ties and organizational affiliations played an important role in mobilizing New Yorkers to participate as stewards. And in fact, 90% of volunteer stewards reported hearing about the event from people they knew or organizations with which they were affiliated. There were some differences between the novices and the repeat stewards that you can read about here on the slide. But this table compares the rates of civic engagement of New York City stewards on the left and the general US population on the right. And volunteer stewards reported being engaged in all types of civic activities, from voting in an election to signing a petition. And in most cases, the volunteer stewards were significantly more engaged in civic and political activities than the American population. So this really begs the question, which came first, the stewardship or the civic engagement? Which way does that sort of causal arrow point? And to help understand that relationship, the authors conducted follow-up interviews 6 months later, after the planting experience. And what they found is that when voting and religious activity were removed, stewardship really preceded other forms of civic engagement for the majority of respondents, and that was across race. So in other words, this tree planting activity actually did serve as an on-ramp to other forms of civic engagement. And they found a reciprocal relationship between stewardship and civic engagement, where those who were the most active volunteers were also the most civically engaged. And then finally, through the interviews, they sought to probe deeper to understand the roots of those stewardship motivations. And they found that stewardship is entwined with this desire to leave a legacy, so often doing things for the betterment of a future generation, with personal identity, so self-expression and connecting to a person over their life course, their own memories and experiences, sense of community, desire to contribute to a place they love and have attachment towards, to help neighborhoods, and then a general awareness and outlook, including an environmental awareness and an outlook on the future. And I think, you can read this quote here, but that encapsulates a lot of these themes about doing tree planting with your daughter for a future generation, because it's important for the environment, and also something a little more hands-on, that desire to do hands-on work. So with that experience from Million Trees in mind, we became interested in studying a more recent effort around citizen science and monitoring of the urban forest, Trees Count, which you heard Jennifer mention. So you've already heard about the program's general sort of structure, aim, and technology, and I'll just focus on the volunteer tree monitors themselves. And here on the slide, you can see a few facts and figures about volunteer participation in this citywide effort. So with this study, we wanted to understand who these volunteers are, how and why they participate in stewardship and other forms of civic engagement, and do we find that these volunteers are motivated by the same thing, or are monitors and tree planters two really different types of people? So, these data weren't collected in exactly the same way as the Million Trees planting data, which were these on-site rapid surveys with a response rate of over 90%. These surveys were sent out by New York City Parks over email, and while we got a good response rate for an email survey, it may be less representative of the total population of Trees Count participants. So I put this thing about preliminary data here. This is part of doing embedded research. We're still QA/QCing our population list just to make sure we don't have any duplicates or missing responses. So I wouldn't cite any of these statistics, but you can see the general trends. We're also going to investigate for non-response bias and all that sort of QA/QCing. So if you want to see the white paper, just get in contact with me or Michelle Johnson. As soon as it's available, we'll share it. So, like tree planters, those participating in Trees Count are more often white, women, and highly educated than the US or the New York City population. Note that about 84% of respondents had university or graduate degrees. And I think this is a really important area to do follow-up interviews with, specifically with underrepresented groups, to understand more about them, about their experiences, about how and why and where they came out. There's a lot more to learn there. In terms of mobilizing, subway and bus ads were the primary way that people heard about the campaign. So some success there in just traditional kind of advertising methods. But also mobilizing through friends, families, and organizations was a key pathway. And so we haven't tested for statistical significance yet, but you can see that tree monitors are also highly civically engaged as compared to the general New York City and US population. So highlighted here in yellow are a few of the things that are higher than the rates for the tree planters. So signed a petition was about 10% higher than for tree planters, and participated in protests was about 10% higher too. We can speculate that perhaps the protest is higher because of the prominent protests related to Occupy, which occurred after the Million Trees study. Petitions might also be higher in 2015, as the presidential campaign was already in full swing when we collected these data, so we need to tease that out a bit more. And then here are a few things that were lower than those for the tree planters. The greatest shift were contacting the local media was about 11% lower than for the planters, and giving a speech was about 10% lower than for the planters. So another important and unique role of stewardship groups in Trees Count that's a little different from Million Trees was to adopt the sort of neighborhood areas for surveying. So this is a map showing the neighborhood areas adopted by civic stewardship groups, as Jennifer described. And there's this really large polygon in the middle that was actually adopted by the Afropunk Music Festival. So it's not all environmental groups, as I mentioned. And we see this sort of building of this into the structure of Trees Count as a really important recognition of the role of civic stewardship groups in monitoring neighborhood trees. And it provides a way for local residents to connect not only with New York City Parks, through this project, but also with those intermediary or umbrella civic organizations that I mentioned. So in future work, we could compare this spatial pattern of adopted blocks to the citywide pattern of stewardship groups. Visually, you can see there's some overlap with our concentration of groups in Central and South Brooklyn. But we can also have discussions as practitioners about what worked and what didn't in this process of working with community groups. I think that's really important to tease out. It was really, a leap of faith or an act of trust on the part of Parks to sort of enable civic groups to work in this way, and I commend them for bringing them into the process. But we also found that people don't always volunteer where they live, so they're willing to travel. Overall, 49% of respondents said they lived in the neighborhood where they worked, which means, the other 50% or so traveled for these experiences. And you can see that there were also, it's a little faint, but there were participants outside the 5 boroughs, so in New Jersey, in upstate New York, Connecticut, and Long Island. So people sought out this sort of participatory environmental experience, even if they weren't themselves New Yorkers. So, looking at the top chart, the majority of these volunteers have engaged with trees somewhere, in yards, on streets, or in parks. but still there's a sizable portion that are tree novices. And about 59% were first-time volunteers with New York City Parks. So the main engagements with parks were volunteer events and Million Trees NYC plantings. So indeed, there is some overlap between planters and monitors. This doesn't get us exactly to the question of retention, but it shows you some of the sort of pathway of engagement that people can have in these different sorts of activities, going all the way back to a few folks who were involved in the 1995 tree census. So why do people participate? This is just a coarse look at whether people were motivated by the environment or by opportunities for social engagement. This was a question used in other environmental motivation surveys, and we just had this simple Likert scale. And you can see that more volunteers were motivated by the environment than by social activities, but it's not uniform across the board. I, too, am a qualitative researcher, so we like to probe deeper than that. And this is based on the open coding of the question, why do you participate? These are the top 10 themes that emerged in descending rank order. So actually trees were the top one. They were mentioned. Love of trees, interest in trees was mentioned by 42% of participants. This general notion of contributing or volunteering among 39%. The idea that it's important or that the environment is important in terms of environmental values. Learning, an interest in learning, particularly species ID was called out. Interest in community and having fun in your community just sounded fun, had an interest. This incentive one, a lot of folks were given an Afropunk ticket if they participated in Trees Count, so it was a direct incentive for mapping trees. And on down the line. So again, you can see that a number of themes do point to people being interested in trees specifically, but not just trees. There are these social themes related to contributing and community, and particularly learning was a major theme that came out. People wanted to learn tree ID, they liked learning the methodology, and they saw this as sort of contributing to science and management through collecting data and helping to make more accurate maps. So overall, we see that stewards are motivated by a mix of environmental and social factors. We also asked people whether they noticed any personal changes in themselves by participating in the census. So this was a preset list coming from other survey instruments. And anything above the red line was noticed as a change by the majority of respondents. So the main changes were a greater awareness of how the neighborhood looks, greater knowledge about how to care for trees, and feeling a greater part of the neighborhood. So this didn't necessarily reach the level of social trust or cohesion. I mean, maybe that takes a longer time to build, but you build on feeling a part of a neighborhood. And also something my colleagues and I were speculating about is that unlike the tree planting, which occurs in sort of this large mass event in a meadow, although these tree census activities were framed as mapping parties, people often worked in pairs. They kind of spread out throughout the neighborhood. So it's probably a different social experience than this like mass party of planting trees. So I think we can follow up a little bit more about the fine-grained sort of experience in follow-up interviews. Somebody else mentioned earlier high satisfaction with these kinds of events. Absolutely. We found that these volunteers were willing both to continue participating in Trees Count and to recommend it to others. So we think this is a strong indicator of the success of the program as a volunteer experience. So in terms of next steps, we're going to continue to QA/QC the data, we're going to write a white paper, and then we'll conduct more quantitative analyses of the survey results, comparing them with the Million Trees planters, and then hopefully later this fall, we'll conduct follow-up interviews to further tease out the motivations of individuals and the role of stewardship groups. It's really exciting. About a third of the survey respondents said they'd be willing to participate in follow-up interviews. So we have a nice, robust sample there to draw on. So just some quick wrap-up points. We can see that there are these different social drivers of urban stewardship at multiple scales, at the scale of the individual and the organization, and that different types of urban forestry practices can serve as the entry point for stewardship engagement, whether it's planting or monitoring, or I didn't talk about the other functions, but you could probably do the same thing around advocacy or conservation. And we found from the Million Trees work that tree planting and civic engagement go hand in hand, which the authors argue can strengthen democracy over time. And just looking, preliminarily at the tree census results, tree monitoring presents opportunities for both contributing to the community and for learning about trees and the environment. So these are some of our collaborators. Please visit the website, come visit us in New York City, and thanks for having me.
Maybe we could just do one. I think we only have time for one question, and then we'll have a coffee break for this afternoon. I think she'd be here too, but Lindsay will be here this afternoon.
So just one quick question. Did you look at all at how differing demographic characteristics change the response to why they chose to participate? So for example, does somebody with no college degree have a different reason for participating than someone with a master's?
Yeah, we haven't done that yet, but that's an obvious next step, so to parse out the data set a little bit more. Now that we've got it coded, that's the hard part. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, maybe we'll just have the one more question then.
For your stewardship map, how many your data sources?
Yeah, I went really fast through StreamMap, sorry. So there were about 20 different citywide, either municipal or nonprofit organizations that contributed their lists of groups. So we didn't survey any individuals, any unaffiliated individuals. And so from those 20 different data providers, it was about 35 different lists, because some of them, whether they're grantees or partners. So when we originally started, it was over 5,000 groups. And then once we cleaned and dealt with duplicates and bad addresses, that's how we got it down to the 2,800. And we have, I should have put this in the slide, we have a general technical report now online that has the exact methodology for how to do StewMap, including all the survey protocols themselves. So the reason we had to do it in that bottom-up way is because about half the groups don't have 501c3 status, so it's not like you can just go to the tax filings. So we chose this sort of bottom-up approach for building the population. But it's pretty replicable. We've done it in other cities.
Great, thank you. Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay.